His book covers 80 years of his life. His journey to an outstanding accomplishment and embrace of culture, technological and political changes. Along the way, and this is very important, along the way, he builds strong friendships across many races and countries, lasting a lifetime. Born and raised in Sawdust. And so, ladies and gentlemen, my fellow Rotarians, fellow Americans, I present to you a PhD, a professional engineer, PE, professor and researcher, Dr. Lewis Thigpen.
Here I'm going to give an overview of my book, but the first thing I'd like to start out with is why I wrote the book. I retired from Howard University in 2008, and had not thought about writing a book of any kind. But as Zert said, I'm from this little community down in Sawdust, and believe it or not, it gets cold down there in the wintertime, and a lot of those houses aren't built for cold weather, particularly pipes. So when it gets cold, people have a lot of pipes that break. So I visit Florida every Christmas except this past one since 1957 or somewhere. I've been going to Florida every Christmas except then. And I was in a hardware store down in Quincy, and I met my former barber. He was in there, and he was also a businessman. He owned a liquor store and a restaurant, as well as a barber shop. And so he was successful, and he wanted to write, prepare an archives of African Americans whom he thought were successful from Gadsden County. And he asked me to provide some information on my career. He followed my career. And I says, okay, when I go back to Virginia, I'll think about it. And I began to write some notes down about my life. But he passed away before we connected on the story there. And there's another person who influenced me writing this book, and that was my grandniece. She lives out in Los Angeles. And when she was in the 5th grade, so I believe that might have been somewhere around 2017 or so, she had a subject to write on, which was African American inventors. And of course they contacted me and asked me about that. I said, well, hey, I have patents, I'm an inventor. So then, I emailed them a copy of my resume, of course, had the patent number and everything in it, so they could just follow up and find all the information about my patent. And the patent was an ice-penetrating sonobuoy. So everybody know what we'd use, all these military people here know what that's about. Listening underwater, under ice, underwater. And so that was my, the patent that she looked up. So here now, I've given an overview of why I wrote the book. Many people ask, well, what made you write the book? Others like, how long did it take you? That depends. It could have been 10 years or 1 year, depending on where you think I began with, either just writing notes down or whatever. I really it really took me about a little over a year to write the book after I really got serious about writing it. My book tells the story of African American born in a rural community. When I was a kid, there was only one store there at the crossing between two highways, and all of the mailboxes were down there. So that was 9/10 of a mile from our house. So to go pick up your mail, you walked almost a mile to get it. So that's a rural community. I grew up on a farm. We were poor people. We began working at a young age down there. Zert mentioned the different things that were growing in Mariana area and Georgia and Alabama. Well, down there in Gaston County, there was shade tobacco. They used shade tobacco to make cigar wrappers. So there's a filling for cigars, but then that shade tobacco, so it's growing on the cheesecloth. And that means that, the leaves can get tender and stay nice and all of that. So it makes a good cigar wrap. The only other place that I know of where they grew that shade tobacco was in Connecticut. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So again, my book is about a poor boy growing up in the Jim Crow South with almost nothing. Those are the kinds of things that are written in my book. Now, the outline of my book has a preface, acknowledgments, table of contents, 5 parts, an epilogue, an appendix, and the appendix is the family tree. I want to relate back to my grandniece so she would know more about the family. So her name is not in there, but her mother's name is in there, so that takes care of that. The parts, there's 5 parts, each part represents a momentous time in my life, so there are 5 parts. Total of 22 chapters in the book. The first chapter begins with my memories of my early years. So I use the word memories so it can cover a lot of things on the early years. Memories of things like my childhood home. There's a picture in the book of that, and you'll see where I came from in that. No running water, no electricity, no phone. A radio with a battery about that large that was not rechargeable. So when you use that battery, you had to buy another one. So that was basically the communication that we had when I was growing up at an early age. I then go into the things like working. Down there at that time, and I've had reviewers ask me questions about the shade tobacco and all. There was a Tallahassee magazine, they asked me about that. There's some of the things that I saw. That's just, well, one thing was they had kids working on those farms during the summers when they were 5 years old. They did what they call tote tobacco, carry it. They used the word tote. So you had somebody we call priming in Connecticut, they call it picking the leaves of the tobacco, and then you give it to these kids. And then they got to walk up to the end of the row, and then they would place it on a barge and stuff. Now, one of the things I can remember, I was working on those farms during those age years, and a lot of times they would dust the tobacco, crop dust, that got dusted. So you got the poison all over you. I tell people I don't know how I lived to be this long working in those tobacco fields. So those are some of the things during my early years, and then my story transitions into my school years. And there were certain racial aspects about schools. The first school I went to, Sawdust School, was across the road from our farm. And so our house was like in the middle of the farm, not on the edge near the road. So you could walk across the field unless you had sugarcane or something planted out there. You didn't want to walk in a sugarcane field and get to the schoolhouse. But there was a school bus that came down the road past our house, and there was a high school and grade school, elementary school in a place called Greensboro. I'm sure you've heard of that. So, and we weren't allowed to go to that school, 3 miles away. And that was because of our race. Later, we moved to Stevens High that you're talking about. We moved to Stevens when I was in the 7th grade. Before that, students went to Stevens when they were in the 10th grade. My 2 older sisters had gone to Stevens before I began going to school. By the way, there's 7 of us, so you can see where I'm number 5 out of 7.